Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hi there, and welcome to episode 67 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story today. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, check out the website at TheKillFile.com, and while you're there, you can check out the new merch. You can submit a case that you want me to cover, or you can fill out the new form for something called the Listener Files. In a few months, I will be rolling out the bonus content on Patreon, where you can pay a few bucks a month for extra episodes from me. As the podcast grows, the perks will grow as well. I started this podcast in hopes that one day it could turn into a full-time job, and as it has become a full-time job, I don't get paid anything. So it would be nice to help my family by the hard work that I do every single week for you guys. It's going to continue to be a free podcast, but the bonus content will help me out. The bonus episodes, called The Hidden Files, will revolve around true crime, but the stories will be a little different than our normal stuff. I'm talking about things like natural disasters, some mobsters, and hopefully some stories from you guys. The listener file submissions form on the website is for one category that I thought would be fun for you guys to write in your own true crime stories, and I'll compile them into an episode and I'll read them back to you guys. This can be anything from a murder in your hometown or where you currently live that maybe stuck out to you, or it could be like a crime that you or someone you know has witnessed or been a part of. I'm looking for anything from maybe a kid that you saw sneak a candy bar in his pocket at a gas station that noticed you had caught him and gave you the eyes like, please don't tell my mom, to something more serious like a priest in your local church was caught with some sex workers. Those never get old. Anything that you want to share and think people would want to hear. They can be light and funny or dark and serious, dealer's choice. Just send those in to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com with the subject line of listener files, or submit the form on the website. Lastly, please take a second to follow us on our social media sites for pictures about cases each week. I'm still trying to boost the amount of posts. I will get there one day, I promise. Also, take a second to review, follow, subscribe, and rate the podcast and all that jazz. Thank you very much. Okay, that's it for today's business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to start with a case that I never planned on covering because it is a very well-known and unsolved set of murders, and I prefer the lesser-known cases. Although sometimes I think that they're lesser-known, and then it turns out that everyone in the world knew but me. So, whatever. But this week is a special one because they just solved this case last month, and we finally get to put a face to the murders that went unsolved for so long. Plus, we get to learn a little more about what this asshole did in his lifetime. Today, we are going to talk about a man named Robert Eugene Brashers. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, rape, and brutality. Here we go. The year is 1991. The place is Austin, Texas. Residents would describe the area at the time somewhat slower than the fast pace of the current bustle, and some would say it was more relaxed. People were nicer, and the lines, along with traffic, were fleeting. One person funnily described it as a place where people were more slacked, as in didn't try to have to work as hard, and maybe this is why people were happier back then. They didn't have to try as hard just to live. If the lines were less, the parking was free, and the concerts were cheap, no wonder people loved it there. Of course, there were some areas to stay away from. Downtown had boarded up buildings and such, and so did some of the sides in the town itself. One place that seemed to be popular by most of the teens was the North Cross Mall. For those of you who are my age, or maybe a little older than me, do you remember how fun it used to be to go to the mall? I am a 90s kid, having been born in 86. The 90s were where it was at for most of what I can remember, but even into the later 90s, I remember how much fun it was to get ready and just go to the mall. Cheap food court meals, noodles, or pizza rolls or whatever, and you could just walk around and look at stuff and see people. We didn't have cell phones or social media, so everyone would go to the mall to have fun. The shops were cool, and the pet stores always had fun stuff to look at. I feel like kids these days are missing out on that simplicity of just wandering around random stores with your friends and looking at stuff that you couldn't afford but showed each other anyways, And Spencer's? Forget it. That and Hot Topic were easily the best stores in the mall to go to, no? Good old Orange Julius, a hot pretzel, and laughing with your friends over a penis on some gag gift. Those were the days, am I right? Well, our story today includes a mall, but the crimes committed were a block or two away at a local strip mall instead of a shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. December 6, 1991, Officer John Jones was being interviewed and followed around by Fox 7 News in Austin, Texas, for a piece that the station was doing about the increase in murders in Austin. Jones was almost done with his shift when he would get a call about a possible triple murder at a yogurt shop, along with a possible fire. When Jones got to the scene, the fire department was working on putting the fire out, while someone told him there was actually 4 bodies, 3 found together and 1 alone on its own. Jones said on the news docuseries that I found during this research called The Yogurt Shop Murders. If you're interested in a more deep dive into the case, I suggest you watch it. The docuseries seemed to compile everything that there is about this case, including other media outlets like 48 Hours, and a person who had started a project on the case, filming and questioning back in 2009, and they put it all together and interviewed anyone and everyone involved. Side note, I'm sorry if my voice still sounds like shit. We had the flu go through the house, and we're finally through the tunnel on the other side, but it's lingering. It was really good, the docuseries, and each episode was about an hour. So Jones gets a call and says when he gets into the yogurt shop, it was full of smoke, steam, and water. In a book written by Corey Mitchell called Murdered Innocents about the case, there was a pretty intense description of what the crime scene was like for the firefighters when they arrived to the scene. Remember, it was initially reported as a fire in the store, and this was, I believe, by a person who worked next door at the party store. According to the book, one of the firefighters, as they were making their way into the shop in a plume of smoke, would see what they thought was a foot and asked his partner if that's what he was seeing too. And when the other one agreed, they decided to take a closer look. As one of the firefighters was crouched inspecting it and realizing that this was indeed a foot, he accidentally bumped into something else, an arm. The firefighter then realized the arm belonged to a different body, and when he looked down, he would see the sad body of a young girl who was laying on her stomach, naked, face down, in at least an inch of water. They quickly realized this was not just a fire, but this was a crime scene. They could see 2 victims, both naked, and one of the bodies was completely burned. They realized the girls were bound behind their backs, and they knew something was not right about this scene. The authorities would call manager of the shop, Reese Price, saying that it was on fire, and asked her to come down. When she was confused, kind of like there's nothing that she can do about it in the middle of the night, they told her they found 4 bodies. She went down to the shop, obviously upset, this poor woman, and they asked if she could maybe help identify the bodies. She would say that she made the choice to try and help identify the bodies because she didn't want the families to have to do this. And at only 24 years old, she went in and she saw the horror. She would say sadly and full of tears that there was no clothing on the victims and no faces and nothing to really identify. I can't imagine what this did to this poor woman, having to see that kind of reality at such a young age. That has to have an effect on the rest of your life, or at least hurt to see the image seared in your brain forever. The medical examiner wanted to bring the bodies to the coroner's office to start examinations right away, but thankfully Jones was able to hold him off until the unit could come and take some DNA swabs, because even though DNA was barely anything back then, maybe it could help. Thankfully, he did this, or the case may never have been solved. Eventually, it would be figured out that the bodies of 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, her younger sister, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and their 2 best friends, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and 13-year-old Amy Ayers, were the victims of a homicide that took place inside the yogurt shop. The 3 girls that were grouped together were Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza, and the girl that was alone just 10 to 12 feet away from them was the youngest of them all, Amy. The 2 main detectives or investigators on this case in the beginning were John Jones, the man who was called to the scene that night, and another man named Mike Huckabee. Now, Huckabee would say immediately that the water was so high, at least ankle deep, in the shop that it would almost have washed away any evidence from the crime scene. And I can imagine that, coupled with the fire, it would be next to impossible to get anything from the scene itself. Someone clearly wanted to remove any traces of the murders. All 4 of the victims were found with gunshot wounds to the back of their heads, And Amy, the youngest, was found with 2 shots to the back of her head. There was found to be 2 guns used, a .22 caliber and a .380. All 4 of the victims were found to have been shot with the .22 caliber, and Amy alone was shot with the .380. Sadly, the girls were found to be nude, tied up with their own items of clothing, bras and underwear. There was also evidence of sexual assault on at least 3 of the girls in this senseless act of violence. The families of the victims were told the awful news of what had happened to their children. One person that was shown a lot in the docuseries was Barbara Ayers Wilson, the mother of Sarah and Jennifer. She would go on to say that when they came to her house that night and broke the news of what had happened to her daughters, she was obviously devastated and horrified. And then they asked her a question, and when she talked about this part, it was super interesting to me, and not something that normally you would maybe think of. She said that the authorities asked her if there was someone that she could call to be with her, and that her immediate response was to lie and say no. She said that it was her immediate response because she didn't want anyone to know. This was the first case where a victim's family really walked us through that process of what it must be like to have to tell everyone. I didn't even think about the fact that I wouldn't want to tell anybody initially. Like, it was so horrible, and that telling other people, even family, would make it real, would make me have to deal with it. And I wouldn't want to see everyone's faces or the pity. It would absolutely kill me. The pain of others would almost be worse than your own pain. Then, of course, she told authorities about her sister, who was close, and they called her to come be with her. Barbara then talked about the fact that when her sister got there, she had to tell her about the girls, and said that the look on her sister's face was something that she will never forget as she was crying. I don't know if you guys have ever had to tell someone horrific news in your life on any scale, but I did once with my son, and although everything ended up being all right, the look on his face, the agony, the tears, the immediate hug, and the grip on me was something that I will never forget in my life. It's awful. Then Barbara said that she had to call the girls' father because they were divorced at the time, and she had to tell him what happened to their children, and said that she had to hear his screams. And then she commented on how his wife got on the phone and asked what happened because he was screaming. And then she had to tell her too. Barbara would comment on how over and over again she had to go through the process of calling people and telling them about the loss of life and how she will never forget those moments. I can't imagine what that process would be like or how traumatic over and over having to do this would be on her mind. It reminded me that horrific acts like this affect someone beyond the loss of the loved one in their life, but also in other ways that we may not think about until it's us. This poor woman lost both of her daughters in one night and then had to tell this horrific news to everyone. It breaks my heart. I think we also never forget the moment that we get phone calls like this from our loved ones. The time that this has happened in my life, I remember always exactly what happened and what I was doing when I received the news about someone I loved dying. As I've heard others express this in my life, their moments of what they went through when this happened always sticks with me as well. It's just one of those human experiences that sticks with you for the rest of your life, right? The evidence from the crime scene included a spent .380 caliber shell casing that was found in the drain, but it didn't include any of the .22 caliber shells. At the crime scene, it was discovered that the front door was locked with a key inside of the door. Reese, the shop manager, would say that this was normal, and sometimes if there were more regulars or whatever in the shop, the girls would lock the door when it came to close, as to not allow other customers in, but the customers would finish up their yogurts. The crime scene would also reveal that the back door was unlocked, and eventually, the newer investigation team that would be put on the case after Jones and Huckabee would allege they believed that someone was either hiding inside around closing time or had already come in during business hours and unlocked the door. My thought on this was maybe the back door was unlocked because that's how the killer left. Why would he want to go through the front where people could see him? The authorities learned that there was money missing from the shop, and this led them to believe that this was possibly a robbery that had gone wrong. But either way, it was an armed robbery. I know some of the authorities thought that if the killer had cased this store, that he would have thought only 2 girls would have been in the shop when there was really 4. Maybe the killer was surprised by this, or maybe the killer walked them to the back and was worried that they would tell someone, and that's why they killed him. During the case, Jones and Huckabee tried their best to solve the case for the families. Jones would speak to the fact that they did some actions that would be like firsts of their kind for the Austin PD while they were working for the case. For example, they put some undercover agents at the funeral to see if anyone was acting weird or asking unusual questions, but this would turn up nothing, unfortunately. There seemed to be almost nothing to go on in this case, but the tips would roll in eventually. There were billboards put up asking for information on the case with rewards offered as well. One of the neat things in researching this case, I really saw the community come together and rally behind these families for the loss of their daughters and for their want of justice. There were advertisements put on the back of taxis, t-shirts made, mugs, pins, etc. to spread the word and to honor the girls. There was even a song made about the tragedy and how the community will never forget. The girls would have a joint funeral, and I can imagine that was comforting maybe to the families to have each other and know that the person you're looking at and hugging and being around knows exactly what you're going through and that you're not alone. Family members of the victims stayed in front of as many cameras as they could in hopes that it would help solve the case in any way. Jones and Huckabee would end up working constantly on this case and getting closer with the family. Well, at least Jones did. He would say it got to the point where the family would just kind of drop by the station whenever, asking for updates or details on anything that they could. As you can probably imagine, that everyone wanted this case solved, and most of all, of course, the families did. One of the resources that I used for this case was the 4-part docuseries, and they interviewed families, judges, the professionals, anyone that was around this case, and some of the suspects, which we will talk a little bit more about later. One of the unique things about the docuseries is that it encompassed part of another documentary that was started on this case back in 2009 and was not finished, as the woman who started it decided that it was just too big for her to do alone, and her name was Claire Huey. And then the newer one was made by Margaret Brown. They were actually able to include all of that footage and those questions as well. So it was neat to see how things have changed since 2009 for the families or suspects or whatever. I think the newer one came out in 2025. I'm just not sure what month. Some of the family members interviewed were the parents of the girls and some siblings. It was interesting to see how the people handled the different aspects of the murders and investigators. One woman that really stuck out who was being interviewed was Sonora Thomas, who was the younger sister of victim Eliza Thomas. Sonora was just 13 when her sister was ripped out of her life, and you can tell that this poor woman has suffered probably every day since. She made it very clear that when this happened, she didn't just lose her sister, but she lost both of her parents as well. She painfully described that her mother reclused to her own room and shut the door constantly, and she stopped going over to her dad's house. Sonora would describe on an interview with 48 Hours that no one in her family talked about her sister after she was gone, and it broke my heart to think that this poor young girl who lost her sister suffered the way that she did with her family. She made so many good points while being interviewed, but one thing was clear, that she's in pain. She seemed disgusted by the fact that people are still intrigued or invested so much in her sister's case, maybe because it's unsolved. She apparently wrote a book, which I would actually be interested to read. Her perspective was unique. In one interview, she talked about how someone had came to question her when she was in college, and the interviewer had pointed out something that her sister liked, and she asked her if this was correct. And this is when Sonora realized that the interviewer in that moment knew more about her sister than she did, as the memory of her best friend was starting to fade, whether pushed or blocked. She felt that it was her job to remember and honor her sister's memory. Now, this is just my opinion, but I definitely got the sense that however Sonora's family handled the death of her sister was not conducive to a healthy household for her to grow up after Eliza was gone. It just felt like no one was there for her afterwards, and you could tell. She was jaded and bothered, seemingly by the fact that people are interested in the story because it was so painful for everyone involved. She kind of made the point that something that should not be forgotten is how things like this continue to affect people long after the violence was enacted. She said she would get home every day and there was mail in the mailbox. Her mom was in her room and her sister was still dead. I wish someone had been there to help this young girl with this trauma, and I wish that if she didn't, that she would have had access to therapy, like immediately. How do you ever move on from something like this? Do you ever? I can imagine the pain, guilt, and the sheer sadness would have the engulfing ability of a tsunami that every day forward would be shaped by the trauma that keeps on giving. The authorities on the case believed that there were most likely two killers who worked in tandem to bind, assault, and murder the four girls. In fact, they would put out statements that someone was out there maybe looking at the killer and knows exactly what they did, and they urged them to come forward. They felt these killers were most likely in their late teens or early 20s, and that one of the killers was probably the dominant one, and the other one was maybe more quote-unquote weak, maybe like a sidekick, and that maybe this person just went along with the stronger one's ideas, and that it seemed like the authorities were pleading with the alleged sidekick, playing on his supposed guilt and hoping that that person would come forward. So, let's talk for a little bit about some suspects and how this case went from bad to worse. About a week to 10 days after the girls were killed at the yogurt shop, the story would come forward in a slight way of what happened leading up to the murders. The day started out as normal, with all of the girls attending school that day, and when Sarah got home that afternoon, she called her best friend Amy to see if she could spend the night. Later in the evening, Jennifer, Sarah's older sister, would take Amy and Sarah to the mall that was close to the yogurt shop called North Cross Mall. The two hung out at the mall that evening while Jennifer and Eliza were both working at the yogurt shop. Before the two had closed the store for the night, Jennifer went back and picked Sarah and Amy up from the mall. That was only like a block or two away, and she brought them back to the yogurt shop to help her and Eliza close. I guess the younger two would sometimes do this. They would actually come and help Eliza and Jennifer close up the store, which they loved because it meant that they would get out earlier than normal if they had some help with the cleanup. It was said that Maria Thomas, Eliza's mother, had shown up at the shop that night between 9 and 9:30 to say hi to the girls and see how Eliza's day went. While the two were chatting, Jennifer returned with Amy, Sarah, and a pizza, and this was when the younger two would meet Eliza's mom for the first time. Sometime later, Eliza's father stopped by with his wife for a quick visit, and that was around 10:30 that night. Now the girls would be cleaning up and getting ready to close. Their last customer was served at 10:45, and it was the last time that any of the girls were seen alive. About a week to 10 days after the murders, two boys would be arrested at the North Cross Mall, which was the same mall that Amy and Sarah were at that evening. The boys were found to be in possession of a .22 caliber handgun, and this is when all hell broke loose. Maurice Price was the boy found in possession of the gun, and his good friend Forrest Wellborn was with him. I'm going to save us a lot of confusion and headache and try to quickly break down what happened here, as it is one long, twisty, and windy case. So when Maurice and Forrest were first arrested, they told one authority figure that it was just the two of them together and that Maurice had the gun in the glove box, but that Forrest grabbed it out and was gone for a little bit. Then this would turn into these two changing their stories to a guy named Hector Polanco, who was seen in the docuseries as someone who was amazing at getting confessions out of people. But the problem was he was so good that he allegedly got people to confess to crimes they didn't actually commit. Now, Forrest and Maurice would also implicate their two buddies all of a sudden, who were named Michael Scott, which made me giggle, and Robert Springsteen. The investigation would now focus on something that was true, with all four boys having made this situation look really bad. The day after the murders, all four of the teenage boys were together, and for whatever reason, they stole a car, and they drove it to San Antonio to visit someone's girlfriend. So, of course, to the authorities, a teenage boy with the same type of weapon a week after these murders, and then it would come out that all four of these kids took off the day after the murder. Yeah, so that didn't look very good to the authorities. The problem would end up being that this case was full of false confessions from all sorts of people all over the place, it would seem. Robert Springsteen, Maurice, and Michael Scott all gave confessions to the authorities at various times in the following 8 years. Eventually, just two of them would be charged and convicted for the crime, and that was Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. So the two that weren't even arrested with the gun. After spending over 9 years in prison from a false confession, they were eventually let out on a personal bond when their convictions and sentences were overturned by the courts, owing to a violation of their Sixth Amendment right. The Sixth Amendment includes a few things like speedy public trial, impartial jury, etc., but the reason stated in this case was that the defendants never had the right to confront their accuser, aka each other. So they both implicated each other in their own cases or whatever, and since they were never a witness in each other's trial, this was what they would have needed to have not been in violation of the Sixth Amendment. Both men were let out of prison on a personal bond by a judge named Mike Lynch, who didn't feel that they could be held any longer in prison and basically told the state that they needed to get their asses into gear and get ready for the trial where they will try to reconvict Michael and Robert again if they believe that they're still guilty of this crime. Well, when it came down to it, the district attorney decided to hold off on retrying them, feeling like they may not have enough to secure another conviction. And although this pissed off a lot of people, she was right. She still believed that these two were guilty of the crime, but she needed more time to prove it. And once that date approached, the charges were dropped. And Michael and Robert were now free men after spending almost a decade in prison for something they didn't even do. They weren't the only ones who would spend some time in prison for this crime who didn't actually do it. A man, nicknamed the Terminator, whose real name was Porfirio Villa Saavedra, would falsely confess to the murders as well, and he would implicate another man with him, Alberto Jimenez Cortez, when he would say they used ropes to bind the girls and beat them. But that's not true. There were many things in this confession that didn't match the actual crime scene, and the investigator Jones, he knew that this wasn't right. He knew that these confessions were bullshit, and he was right. Saavedra would then come out and allege that he was forced to sign the confession by the authorities, saying that the police put a bag over his head, punched him, and threatened to hurt him or his family if he didn't confess or sign it. Which is horrific for that man. Like, I don't know if this guy was a criminal or not, but either way, that's not okay. Another thing that was brought up in this case that I thought was extremely interesting and would love to know your guys' opinion about is the subject of what loved ones of the victims should be allowed or not allowed to know and when. Bob Ayers had questions about what happened to his daughter. If you recall, one of the first investigators on this case was Mike Huckabee, and when Bob asked specific questions about his daughter, Huck had some what I thought were unusual responses, but it got me thinking. So I guess this is, according to the docuseries, Bob had approached Huck and asked him some stuff pertaining to the case, and Bob would go on to say that he felt frustrated and that they weren't given specifics and details, just in case the information were to get out and hurt the case. So Bob was like, what, am I going to jeopardize my own daughter's case? Seemingly like, duh, I want them caught too. Why would I leak or say anything? You know how sometimes the investigators like to keep some information close to the chest in cases that maybe only the killer would know, that will help point to the real person when that time comes? I'm not sure if that was what was happening here or not, but when Bob was asking about his daughter and how her body was found, like nude or not nude and tied up or whatever, Huck eventually said to Bob admittedly, like, where are we going with all this? To me, it seemed like Huck knew exactly where Bob was going with all of this, but maybe didn't want to tell the father of this poor girl exactly what had happened because it's too awful. Bob wanted to know if his daughter had been raped, and that's when Huck told him to stop right there. He admittedly said that this was not good for either of them. Huck would tell Bob that he promised that Bob did not want to know everything. Huck, on an interview, would say that in a rather crass way, he wasn't going to tell Bob, quote, all that crap, saying that he didn't really need to know, and that he himself wished that he didn't know. So here's my question to you guys. Is it the loved one of a victim's right to know every single detail about their loved one's case? Do they deserve at any given point to know each and every little thing that there is to know pertaining to the case? So I gave this some thought, and here's what I came up with. I could see there being something in place, like legally, and I have no fucking clue what I'm talking about, so just go with me here. But where, like, after a certain amount of time, if a case is unsolved, that the family gets access to, if they want, the details of what happened to their loved one. So let's say that it's a year into a case and it's unsolved. Maybe that's the point in time where they're allowed to know it all. Because here's my thought. On the one hand, I understand that authorities have a job to do and they want to solve the case, and maybe there are some details that could hurt it or whatever. But on the other hand, people deserve to know, right? Like, a year's time, I think, would be a good amount of time for maybe some loved ones that might at first think that they want to know every little detail, and then realize later as the healing process might begin, or if nothing else, there's been a little bit of time to settle some emotions before really deciding if this is something that they want or need, or if it's just something they really don't want to know but they thought they did. Because I can understand why Huck didn't think that Bob needed to know every detail of what happened to his daughter. I really do. But looking at it from Bob's point of view, he wants to know exactly what his daughter went through. And maybe as much as it hurts him, he needs to play out what happened in his head and put himself in his daughter's shoes in order to really start to cope with the loss. I don't know if we get to decide what people do or don't need to know or get to know when it comes to these types of situations or the trauma that comes with it. Either way, his life is changed forever. And for some people who want to be involved in the case and who want to help catch the fucker who did this, a clearer picture may be needed. What are your thoughts on whether the family members or whoever deserve or should they have the right to know everything when it comes to their loved ones? Let me know on the socials and we can talk about it because I'm dying to know what other people's thoughts are on this. Okay, before we move on to how this case was finally solved last month, there is one more thing to note. Maurice Pierce, the boy who was rough around the edges and was caught with the gun and then was in and out of this case, was someone who was always thought of as a prime suspect. And I want to remind you that there were false confessions that confused everyone. But without those, all Maurice did wrong was have the same type of gun on him not long after the murders. After he'd been implicated by some of his buddies as being the quote-unquote ringleader, he spent a few years in jail because he wasn't able to make his bail. When he got out in 2002, after the charges were finally dismissed, his wife and daughter were happy to have him home. On December 23, 2010, Maurice Pierce was stopped for a routine traffic stop, but he took off on foot. Officer Frank Wilson pursued Maurice where he was able to catch up to him, and then the two began to struggle. As Officer Wilson was trying to gain control of Maurice and take him down to the ground, he apparently felt his neck and something was wet. During the struggle, Maurice had grabbed the officer's knife off of his belt and proceeded to stab or cut the officer's neck. This is when Officer Wilson would shoot a single shot that would end up killing Maurice Pierce. The officer would survive his injuries. In June of this year, so 2025, a Detective Jackson who had been assigned to the yogurt shop case would realize that the .380 caliber bullet that had been found in the drain at the yogurt shop was not yet submitted into something called NIBIN in quite a few years, and since then the system has had many improvements. NIBIN, for anyone who doesn't know, because I sure shit did not, is the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, and this is a database that would help to identify and search for evidence within the database by correlating images against it. It helps law enforcement search with any jurisdiction or nationally within the ballistics database to help solve crimes. The next month, so July of this year, they would receive a hit on the ballistics to an unsolved murder that had happened in Kentucky back in 1998, and when it was further investigated, there were some similarities between the yogurt shop case and the murders in Kentucky. In August of 2025, Detective Jackson would request something called a YSTR manual search from every lab in the U.S. that keeps the YSTR profiles. YSTR is short for Y chromosome short tandem repeat. STR, or short tandem repeat markers that are located on the Y chromosome, is something that is often used in forensic cases. Often this is something that would be used to work on a female sexual assault victim's case caused by a male suspect. According to Wire's Forensic Science, the YSTR analysis is actually able to detect what an article calls minuscule amounts of male DNA from one or many genetically male donors, and with these, the genetic profiles that are made can be compared to other samples. So then there was a bunch of scientific genealogical parts to the article that, while fascinating, was a little confusing and too much to go into. But basically, they use genetic markers, or they use alleles, which are different versions of the same gene, to identify a suspect. That's like the most basic thing that I could use in order for the next part to make sense. Science. So while there were quite a few labs that had some hits on some of the markers, they only had maybe like 17 out of 27 markers at most. But then one lab was able to match all 27, which ended up being a state lab of North Carolina. On August 22nd, Detective Jackson got the call that DNA from the yogurt shop murders was also linked to a sexual assault and murder that had occurred in 1990 in Greenville, South Carolina. The DNA matched a known rapist and serial killer named Robert Eugene Brashers. There isn't a lot known about Brashers' childhood or background, but there are some things that we can know about his crimes. Apparently, Brashers was arrested in 1985 after he made some sexual advances at a woman in Florida. She rejected him, which she's allowed to fucking do, and he shot her for it. Brashers was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the crime. But of course, what is the theme in all of these cases? He got out after only serving 4 years and ended up being on parole in May of 1989. I wonder how many lives could have been saved by keeping this violent offender behind bars for his full sentence. Back in 2018, authorities were able to link Brashers to a killing of a mother and a daughter that took place in 1998. Sherry Scherer, sorry if I butchered that, and her daughter Megan were both murdered in their home in Missouri, a place called Porterville, which is said to be 150-ish miles southeast of St. Louis. Disturbingly, the authorities were able to find out that he had sexually assaulted the 12-year-old little girl in that case. In a report from the Missouri State Highway Patrol Division that same day that he had killed Sherry and Megan, a man was said to have stopped in a van to ask for some directions and tried to force his way into the home of a 25-year-old woman who had children with her at her home. Brashers was said to have brought out a handgun, and the woman and him had a struggle. He shot her in the arm as she was trying to keep the man and her children safe. After the woman contacted the authorities, there was a composite sketch made, and eventually ballistics would connect this incident to the murders of Sherry and Megan. The authorities were also able to link Brashers to a killing of a woman named Genevieve Zitricki that took place in 1990, when she was found murdered in her home in Greenville, South Carolina. Genevieve was a 28-year-old woman that sadly had been found beaten and strangled in her own bathtub. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head as well, and evidence of sexual assault. This attack was said to have happened when Brashers snuck into Genevieve's home through a sliding glass patio door while she was sleeping. The FBI described it as a blitz attack. She was found in her tub after she didn't show up for work. There was yet another case that Brashers was linked to, and this time it was a rape of a 14-year-old girl at the time who had lived in Memphis, Tennessee, or at least was visiting, if I understood it correctly, and this took place in 1997. This identification was thanks to CODIS, yes, and the advancements of DNA. This incident was said to have taken place on March 11th, 1997, when the 14-year-old girl was at a residence in Memphis where there were said to be 4 other people with her. When there was a knock at the door, I'm assuming someone must have answered it because the report said that someone was trying to close the door on the man when he pulled out a revolver and made his way into the residence. I couldn't find any more details. Not that I needed them, but I couldn't find anything else to as what happened in that story. But less than 48 hours after the yogurt shop murders, Brashers was stopped by Border Patrol that was located between El Paso, Texas and Las Cruces, New Mexico. At the time, Brashers was driving a stolen vehicle that was from Georgia, and on him was found a .380 pistol. The serial number to this gun was not only the same gun that was used for the second shot into Amy Ayers, but it was also the gun that was used when Robert Eugene Brashers committed suicide. This was back in 1999. Ugh, it is such an unsatisfying ending for everyone involved. I mean, on the one hand, good riddance to that fucking asshole, you will not be missed, but on the other hand, there was just no justice served for what he did to those poor girls, and nothing further can come from the senseless acts committed on them. I am glad for the families to finally know who took their children from them and be able to put a face to the blank man that they must have been picturing for so long. Brashers, back in 1999, had had a standoff with the authorities for hours on end while he was holed up in a motel in Kennett, Missouri. In 2016, the rape kit from the 14-year-old was tested, and in 2018, Brashers' body was exhumed and DNA was taken from him. I read that Brashers had a daughter. Her name was Deborah Brashers, and she told local news outlets that she was shocked and sad to learn that her father was linked to all of this. She would further say that she was only a baby when the yogurt shop murders had taken place, and when her father committed suicide, she was just an 8-year-old. She would say, according to ABC6 Action News reporting from an interview with KXAN-TV, quote, "I'm very sorry to every family that my father hurt. I know that it is not my place to tell you that I'm sorry, but someone has to, because he was not sorry for it. And half of my DNA is the person that hurt you the most. So I want to tell you I'm sorry, and I'm so sorry for everything. But I am finally glad that you are getting answers." End quote. I thought that quote from her was very thoughtful and sweet, and I cannot imagine what it would be like to find out that your own father was the one who committed these atrocious acts, like all of these. I guess she said she thinks that there's going to be even more cases linked to him eventually. And that, my friends, is the story of Robert Eugene Brashers, the serial killer and rapist who got away with way too much, and we might be hearing about again in the future. First off, I want to say that I am so glad that anyone who was affected by this turd now has a name to put to the face to him in whatever way that he affected them. The latest being the yogurt shop murders being solved and him being known now. After knowing who did it and researching this case and watching the documentaries and reading the material and some of the book that I used, it was hard not to think of it in terms of knowing it's none of the people that this case had brought in as suspects and how many lives were ruined or affected by the investigation alone in the yogurt shop murders. I hope that everyone can start to heal and those affected by the falsehoods are able to move on because they deserve it. Secondly, this man is just one of the most unsatisfying stories I have ever heard or told. The fact that he committed suicide has made so much of this a mystery. And we won't only not see justice done for the victims of this fucking monster, but he created other situations from his own selfishness of suicide. He made his daughter a victim in the process, and he left so many unanswered questions and nowhere to put the feelings. Ugh, it bugs the fuck out of me that nothing more can be done, and that this fucker had a wife and a daughter, and instead of being there with them, he was out doing whatever the fuck he wanted and left a trail of bodies and victims in the wake of his trauma tornado. He fucking sucks. I hope that more people continue to get the answers that they deserve as DNA continues to come along. And I guess we will have to wait and see who else this asshat traumatized if there are more victims out there. Besides the fact of an unsatisfying ending, at least the mystery of who killed the 4 innocent girls in the yogurt shop that awful evening is answered, but we may never really know why or how it came about. I hope that more answers come out. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about how wonderful DNA is, and to also know that these types of things will hopefully continue to be lessened by the advancements in technology and DNA forensics. Yay, science! I hope to see you guys back next week for another case here on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye! Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.